So it's time to continue our story of Jack and Annie in the dark day in the deep sea. If you remember in chapter 4 yesterday, we learned how they got aboard their ship and they got to meet a couple new characters. Can you remember who they might be? So there was another professor and there was the captain. And the captain wasn't too thrilled about them being on board the ship. So let's find out what happens now as we continue our story with chapter 5 and Ooze. The captain turned and strode away. Sorry, friends, Henry said to Jack and Annie, but the captain's in charge. And he looked around. I see Joe and Tommy are helping the men bring up the catch now. As soon as they are free, I will ask them to take you back to shore. I'm very sorry. That's okay. You did what you could. Before you young people leave, perhaps you would like to see today's specimens, asked the professor. Sure, said Jack and Annie together. Then come along, said the professor. Every single day we make new discoveries. Hurrying with Annie across the deck, Jack couldn't wait to see what they had just brought up from the deep. They followed Henry and the professor to a team of sailors pulling up large nets. The nets were shaped like giant bags with mops attached to the bottom. What are those mops for? Asked Annie. Well, they sweep up the sea animals from the floor of the ocean, explained Henry. We pull them from pitch darkness into the light of day, said the professor. Well, that must scare them, said Annie. But the professor didn't seem to hear her. Over the years, we've hauled up tens of thousands of specimens, he said. And as the sailors dumped the bags onto the deck, Jack saw mostly mud. But lying in the middle were tiny, squirmy pink and yellow fish and fiery orange sea stars. No monsters there, huh? Asked Annie, and the professor looked at her. Not today, my dear, he said. I was just kidding, said Annie. Do you believe in monsters? Oh, well, the professor looked serious. The sea is very deep, my dear. It covers nearly 3/4 of the world. So I say to myself, where am I? There we go. Might it not indeed hold many mysterious creatures, including monsters? Good point, thought Jack. But don't be afraid, children, said the professor. Someday we'll catch all the monsters and study them, and we'll conquer our fears through knowledge, won't we, Henry? Yes, sir, said Henry. Conquer our fears through knowledge, the professor repeated his thought with enthusiasm. I shall add that to my lectures. Low thunder rolled in the sky, and Jack looked up. The black clouds hovered overhead, and a strong gust of wind swept over the deck. Attention, the captain shouted, heading toward them. A squall is headed our way. For now, take the children below to the main deck. Yes, sir, said Henry, and he smiled at Jack and Annie. Well, friends, I suppose you get to stay with us a little longer after all. Yay, Annie said softly. Only those on watch stay on deck, the captain shouted to his crew. Everyone else, get below. Henry led Jack and Annie away just as the rain began to pour down, and water dripped from Jack's hair and backpack and life vest as he and Annie followed Henry down a deep flight of stairs to a dimly lit hallway. Our ship was converted from a war vessel to a ship of sea laboratories, Henry said, and the Navy removed 16 of the 18 guns on board to make room for them. Would you like to see mine? Oh, yes, said Jack. He couldn't wait to see an actual sea laboratory. Follow me. Henry unlocked a door and showed Jack and Annie into a large, dim room. There was a small skylight overhead, and rain pounded against the glass. And Henry struck a match and lit a couple of oil lamps. Shadows danced around the room. Jack smiled and let out a deep sigh. He loved the sea lab. Shelves were lined with hundreds of different-sized bottles. The bottles were filled with floating blobs. In the middle of the room was a wooden table. It held maps, rulers, thermometers, bowls with gooey-looking stuff, and a big microscope. Can you imagine being in a laboratory like that on a ship? and all the things. Can you see a picture in your mind of what Jack must be and Annie, what they must be looking at right now? Do you have any wonderings about some of the stuff they just said, about the gooey looking stuff and the blobs? Does it make you want to jot something down on one of your sticky notes? Henry pointed at the microscope. Would you like to see something remarkable? He asked. Oh, yes, said Annie, and she peered through the eyepiece. Oops, got to go back. Peered through the eyepiece. Let's see here. Don't lose me now. There we go. And she peered through the eyepiece. Where am I? Oh, there we are. You guys are so good. Just waiting me find this. Whoa, that's amazing, she breathed. Let me see, said Jack. He put his backpack down on the table and looked in the microscope. He saw a tiny skeleton of a seahorse. Cool, he said. That seahorse is no bigger than a grain of sugar, said Henry. But of course, I'm fascinated by larger creatures as well. Why, just yesterday I spent hours studying the ear bone of a dolphin and the tooth of a shark. And what's in all those bottles? Asked Annie, and she pointed to the rows and rows of bottles on Henry's shelves. Many curiosities, said the scientist. Curiosities. Well, I know that curious means you want to know more about it, but what does it mean when they say many curiosities? So it makes it plural. So I wonder if the scientist is referring to all those bottles, and there's something curious in each one of those bottles that he wants to discover. So that large one, for instance, holds a creature that looks like a giant sock. Some call it a blubberfish, but it's not a fish at all. It's made up of millions of tiny sea creatures. Ew, said Annie. And there's a rare sea slug, said Henry, and he pointed to a bright yellow blob floating in a clear liquid. I wonder if that's the blob that they were talking about earlier. I wonder if we found evidence in our text now. Nice color, said Jack. We study whatever we bring up from the sea, said Henry. We measure the specimens and identify them. Then we preserve them in bottles of alcohol and label the bottles. So all those bottles are full of dead sea creatures, said Annie. Oh, no. Many bottles are simply filled with ooze from the bottom of the sea, said Henry. Ooze, said Jack. The official name for mud, said Henry, smiling. Here, feel it. And Henry picked up one of the plates on the table and held it out to Jack and Annie. And they rubbed the sticky wet mud between their fingers. Ooze is a good name for it, said Jack. And Henry gave them a cloth to wipe their hands. Then he picked up a large book from the table. And here is the notebook where I transfer my drawings of natural history specimens, he said. And he opened them inside. Inside were beautiful watercolors of shells and plants and butterflies. These are great, said Jack, and Henry's notebook reminded him of the notebooks he'd seen in Leonardo da Vinci's studio. So I think that's when they went on a different adventure. This is beautiful, said Annie, and she reached across Henry's table and picked up a gleaming round seashell. The shell was white with curved reddish-brown lines. Yes, said Henry softly, my nautilus shell. Is this one of your specimens? Asked Annie. No, said Henry. I don't consider that a specimen. It's more like a treasure. I'm afraid I grew quite fond of the little creature who once lived inside that shell. What did he do? Asked Annie. Oh, he just swam around in the small tub I had for him, said Henry. But he moved backwards. Rather funny. He filled himself with water and then squirted it out all over me. Henry smiled. I was quite sad when he died. I wished I had returned him to the sea. Henry put down the shell and he let out a quiet sigh. Ah, silly to think that way, I know. Not silly at all, said Annie. And the ship's bell rang. Now, time to go, said Henry. The captain runs a tight ship. It's against the rules to be late. So let us be off to the wardroom. What's the wardroom? Jack asked. Do you have an idea what it might be? I wonder. It's an interesting question. I wonder if we'll find the answer in our text here. Let's keep reading. That's where the scientists and naval officers eat, said Henry. Eat? Jack said weakly. The thought of food made him feel queasy again. Yes, said Henry, and he blew out the 2 oil lamps. Come along. You must join us. It's lunchtime. Tomorrow we will read chapter 6. So go ahead and start working on your vocabulary word, I believe, for the day, and on your ask and answer questions.